Hello again, I am Geoff Shullenberger, and this is Blame Theory, where we take a seriously playful look at the ideas that have shaped our minds and our world to ask how have we ended up here, and whom or what can we blame. I am joined, as usual, by Ashley Frawley. How's it going, Ashley?
Not too bad. How are you?
Pretty good, pretty good. So we are continuing our series on the crisis of liberalism. This will be part 3. If you haven't checked out parts 1 and 2, you can find them in the Blame Theory feed. And this piece will be focused on something Ashley wrote in the pages of Compact recently called How Society Got a Sex Change. So I really think this piece, in a very efficient way, does something that I'm not sure anybody else has done, at least to my satisfaction, which is explain the centrality of gender, sort of gender theory, gender ideology, and related phenomena, debates about trans identity and all of these issues, and explain why these issues have become so salient and what their kind of larger political importance is today. And I think you managed to do this in roughly 1,000 words. It's the kind of task I could imagine someone devoting a whole book to. But I think it does it in an incredibly elegant way. So nicely done, first of all.
Oh, thanks. That's very kind of you, especially because this was actually like a 3,500 word vomit on a page
Yeah.
that I sweated over for way, way, way too long before I was like, I'll just ruthlessly cut absolutely everything. And hopefully I'll be able to explain it when everyone gets mad at me.
Yeah, no,
Yeah,
it's
people have been contacting me from like Canada, and it's really traveled quite a lot. So if listeners haven't read it, you might go and have a look. It's a quick read.
yeah. So another thing it does, which kind of relates to the, I suppose, larger interests of the podcast, which I don't think you set out to do specific or explicitly, but it sort of ends up doing, is provide an explanation of like how do we make sense of the influence of a Judith Butler or someone along those lines who, in sort of more standard, I guess, conservative sort of blame narratives, it's often like, oh, well, we all had just kind of normal trad understandings of gender, and then Judith Butler came along and sort of corrupted the youth with these bad ideas. And this is a standard kind of blame theory narrative, right? It's sort of blame gender theory, blame Butler. I think what you do is show how, as I understand it, someone like Butler sort of supplies a way of thinking that has a particular utility to society in the phase that it's entered in recent years. And so, in other words, it's not that Butler is the kind of unmoved mover or cause of these developments. It's that Butler's ideas end up coming in handy to serve a particular function within a broader kind of societal shift, and specifically in terms of how the political subject is conceived of. So that's how that this shift is an ongoing process, and that these ideas provide a certain way of framing that, which proves particularly useful and sort of productive, for the purpose of kind of legitimating this transformation. Is that a fair assessment of how? Because again, I don't think you explicitly say this is how I understand Butler to play a role in sort of the evolution of society, but that's sort of that's kind of what I took away from your account.
No. So she gives voice to a kind of a trend. She gives voice to something that is already happening, a kind of deterioration of the subject already happening, kind of ideologically. And when these ideas are kind of out there, she uses as a jumping off point, the feminist kind of critiques of Simone de Beauvoir and others who well, Simone de Beauvoir doesn't like straight up say like Enlightenment man is male, but this was a very common thing that was going around, and they were saying there was this idea like, well, the subject is masculine. Like that's just, it was supposed to be universal man, but it hid a white man, etc. And she takes it a step further and she says, well, there isn't any subject at all that stands before the law. The subject is constructed by the law, by these sorts of relations. And that was kind of also the idea that was already very prevalent and becoming more and more prevalent in like international development, for instance, that the sort of age um, of uh, of growth liberalism was already dying a death not long after, the World Health Organization's 1948 declaration of, the definition of health is like the greatest possible health, not just the absence of disease, which is a very kind of, this idea that everyone around the world is going to reach the same level of development, the same level of health, and so on. And you can kind of like move ahead a few decades and they're like, the Millennium Development Goals, babies won't die of starvation and we will, like, what happened to the greatest possible health? So what had happened in the meantime was that growth wasn't happening. There was this, this idea, there had been this idea that we need to go abroad into developing countries, we need to inculcate a powerful kind of entrepreneurial subject. And development will do this anyway. By seeing every time that they tried to implement these programs in the developing world, they always came up against people who were quite fatalistic and traditional and so on. And this was a barrier. And so they were like, okay, well, we improve people's conditions and this will cure them of their fatalism and so on. But what actually happened was, when you started to improve people's conditions, or you promised that you would, and then you didn't, people got raised expectations that were then thwarted. And they moved, they left. They started immigrating to countries in which these things did exist. Or it created global instability. And, the Western world has always been really afraid that the developing world will hold it to ransom because they've got all the resources and so on. And so for a long, long time, the project of development had been moving away from, as I say at the end of the article, I don't bring in, this is why I said like the article was like a 3,500 word mess because I had brought in all this stuff about development. But I kind of nod to that at the end of the article where I said like, it's a new kind of development of the subject. The subject is the end point of our post-liberal world. That is what is being constructed, not bricks, not steel, not bridges, not buildings. Ideally, what is being constructed is you. And that is a project that goes back since the failure of growth liberalism. I probably, I suppose, the 60s, maybe earlier than that. Not long after, the Second World War, there's this realization kind of sets in. But anyway, so this subject, the citizen, becomes more and more the object of global governance, and the subject is something that can be constructed, and it has its roots obviously in Enlightenment liberalism, the idea of like a blank slate, and you're not sort of that biology isn't destiny, the radical decoupling of race and ethnicity, race and culture, and so on. But it kind of becomes more powerful and less liberal the more it becomes bound up with these ideologies of why things are going wrong. Like, why did growth liberalism fail? Why does capitalism fail? And the answer, and really the only answer available to anybody ever in in our good learned leaders, is you. They don't have any economics that is capable really of understanding how problems can arise out of rational behavior, that how problems can arise out of a system working as it should. It's always the system is breaking down in some way, and you have to figure out, well, like, where's the deviation, where's the market failure, what is deviating from the expected equilibrium. And culture has often been this deviation. And so if you can kind of go in and create subjects that are more malleable, more adaptable, more willing to kind of move with the changing times, and you can hopefully kind of deal with some of these problems. And culture frequently kind of gets in the way of that. It makes people maladaptive. It makes people less resilient, this kind of thing. And I realized that my way into this is perhaps way, way, way too complex. And I should have just sort of started by saying that my thesis of this article is that the trans subject, quite apart from the reality of people actually transitioning, because it's a similar thing with like their exaltation of the feminine subjects, got very little to do with actual women, but they're sort of like the trans subject is for global governance a symbol of the ideal subject. It is a subject that is committed to a project of the self, and that is its world building. And that is what they think, that is their project too. There's nothing beyond the self. That is the subject is the end, it is the goal, it is the purpose of governance, of development. It's you. We build people now. We don't build the world. In fact, the human footprint is this negative thing that like we learned in the 20th century, that human hands on history is a really bad thing. And you have to kind of mitigate the damage. And that is what our governance is about now. It's about understanding the damage caused by human beings. I call this a misanthropology. And I'll probably write a book. Don't steal that title because that's mine. Probably write a book with that title. And I kind of envisioned this as a chapter in it. I'd have to kind of flesh it out, obviously, more and think it through a bit better. So it's sort of we developed this kind of misanthropology, and that becomes the overriding obsession of academia, of those in power, of economics, and so on. It's to sort of figure out like what is it that makes the subject so bad, so wrong. And it is so powerful in our culture that whenever you try to have a conversation with somebody, they'll be like, they always come, well, it's just human nature. It's just human nature. Or you ask conspiracy theorists, like it's across the political spectrum, but you ask conspiracy theorists, and well, why would people do that? Oh, because that's just the way human beings are. They're greedy. Or you ask people on the left, well, why would people do that? And they'd be like, oh, it's greed, or it's this, or they don't have an answer, or it's the bad people in power. And it's very kind of similar thing. And I always said, like, as a Marxist, I didn't need to evoke that. I didn't need to evoke human greed or human weakness or anything like that. It's the system working as it should that produces these problems. And we've kind of lost that analysis. That's gone. And it wasn't just Marx's analysis either. It was, classical political economy was capable of attempting to understand problems as arising out of the proper functioning of the system as like puzzles that need to be solved. Like why does monopoly develop? Why is there falling rate of profit? And at the sort of close of the 19th century, we started to develop a political economy that began to deny that was possible, and develop complex mathematics to prove that actually everything works as it should. And the problem is the problem is human irrationality. They are not rational actors within this. They're sort of anomalies. And there's all these things that human beings kind of introduce that make the system so very, very difficult to run. And so you kind of begin to intervene around the economy in people's minds and in their behaviors and so on. And so more and more, as things go wrong, as we have recurrent problems, as we have recurrent crises, or we have war, or we have failures in development, or whatever, or plans, whatever it is, some policy doesn't work out, people don't ask themselves, oh, like maybe it didn't work because I didn't understand the problem correctly. Perhaps the problem was not human behavior. They go, oh, wow, human beings are so much worse than I thought. They're just so much more defunct. Like there's just a deep darkness in human nature that maybe can't be rooted out. And so they just become more obsessed with the human subject. And for a long time, I have argued that the subject has been feminized, that the ideal subject, and we talked about this in some of the first podcasts, that's what I talk about in my second book, that the ideal subject had been feminized, had been emotionalized, and this was supposed to be like a receptive kind of citizen, a heteronymous citizen. And as I've said, it reifies all these negative stereotypes that have been associated with women and were reasons that women were ostensibly not suited for public life. And instead of being like, oh, well, we were wrong about that, ladies, they're like, oh no, everybody's that. Like it's not like everybody gets, oh, we were wrong. Everybody has this capacity for reason. Everybody is capable of being in the public sphere because of that. It's like, well, actually, no, really, like humanity is over emotional. Humanity is all these different things that mean that really democracy is questionable. And actually that's fine. We should recognize that. We should sort of recognize our emotional vulnerability and all this sort of stuff. But I think what has happened is that if you look through, and I use an example in the article of a UNESCO program, which is just crazy because it's in like some of the poorest countries in the world. And they're like, they've got lesson plans like talk to children as young as 5 to ask them to reflect on their gender identity and how does it feel to have a gender identity. So they sort of introduce these concepts to children. Um, and it's interesting if you look at like UN documents, they say we should elevate trans people to positions of power. We should have trans people in positions of power in communities, in families, in legislatures, in legal areas, to set an example for people. And remember, like in the same breath, they say, and remember that we should encourage people to come out, and that coming out is not a one-time thing, but a constant process in one's life as you move through different families, different cities, different jobs, different friends. So this is the subject of kind of like all that is solid melts into air, the subject that accepts that you're going to have different families, different friends, different cities, different jobs, that you're not going to have a job for life. That's gone. And you are a resilient subject that is capable of reinventing yourself, not just for the millions of different jobs and so on, but literally reinventing yourself and being comfortable with this constant process of adaptation, of like developing your identity in line with every new place that you go to. That's quite contra to what trans people talk about, which is that they hate having to come out over and over and over again. But this is great. And it's and I mentioned before that tradition often acts as this kind of is often seen as this barrier to adaptability, and men in particular are really sort of or like hegemonic masculinity, they often call it, is really seen as this barrier. And like the trans person signifies a letting go of tradition, a letting go of old attachments, of a complete, you like we talk about like dead naming, right? It's nothing. You let go of a whole past. Everything, every role that you were supposed to have is gone, and you are completely open. But it's also highly dependent on institutions. So the institution, the institution must recognize you. The institution must ratify you. Must give you the toilet. Must recognize who you are. Give training to people in terms of the new ways of dealing with people. Um, and so, yeah, so that's sort of like the broad kind of argument that I'm trying to make. And there's a lot more that I could talk about there in terms of like why masculinity is so maligned. And this idea that the right gets wrong, where they're like, oh, this is all Marxist, this is all transhuman, but it's not. It's a very particular kind of science and a very particular kind of identity.
Yeah, a lot to unpack there. I mean, one thing that's striking to me is your point about connecting this to development economics, which seems, I mean, your UNESCO case is fascinating and bizarre, as you say. If you imagine these sort of
Oh, there's so many
ideas
more of
being
those. It's crazy.
promulgated in some village in Chad or something, but it's very odd on one level. But the other thing that this is kind of a tangent, but the other thing that kind of fascinates me here is Foucault. I mean, I've kind of done a lot of, reading and thinking about Foucault in the last couple of years. And one thing that's interesting about his trajectory, and of course, he's another figure whose ideas become useful for this way of articulating this or sort of re-articulating the subject. Even though I think, he's not, he's a kind of, skeptical figure in some ways on all of this stuff, or at least would be attuned to how this could. And particularly when it's institutionalized, how it can be marshaled for, projects that are not liberating at all, right? And so you have to imagine he would be very attuned to that kind of set of developments. But at the same time, his ideas about the subject, this kind of more, this kind of more fluid, understanding of the subject would be useful at the same moment that this kind of thinking is being operationalized in various ways. And then, I mean, the other thing that's kind of interesting to me that connects to your point about or you're tying it to kind of development economics and the end of a kind of model where we build things as opposed to, and its replacement by a model in which we kind of build and rebuild and constantly remake sort of human subjects. And the project is, the project of development becomes kind of internalized. Something that's kind of interesting is that Foucault, in political terms, he becomes very aligned with the early sort of humanitarian liberal establishment. If you think of someone like Bernard Kouchner, the founder of Doctors Without Borders, very close ally and friend of Foucault. So Foucault is somebody who, I mean, part of his break with the sort of traditional French left, so he breaks with the Communist Party, criticizes the left on various grounds. And then, there's this whole debate about the Vietnamese boat people, where you have this one idea that, no, the fundamental question here is political. These people are, presumably sort of reactionary opponents of the revolutionary, Marxist government that's taken control in Vietnam, and therefore they're not our allies, if we are European leftists or Marxists. Whereas the Kouchner position, which becomes kind of the much more dominant one, is that there's just this kind of broader humanitarian imperative, right? That there's a kind of it's a post-political vision in which the goal of the sort of progressive left should be simply to pursue humanitarian projects without regard for the political contexts in which particular humanitarian crises are unfolding. And so Foucault is kind of, somebody who aligns himself with and then he, in the early 80s is participating in trips to Eastern Europe and sort of aligning himself with anti-communist dissidents. So, this is maybe a bit tenuous, but it's interesting to me that he's somebody who, and of course he's also a sort of sympathetic observer of like neoliberalism in many respects, and so he's somebody who's kind of part of, in the sense of influencing this kind of reconception of the subject. And then he's also connected to these political projects, which in many ways frame themselves as kind of post-political projects that, break with the, progressive and particularly sort of communist or Marxist left as it had existed up until the sort of early to mid 70s. And instead, pose these kind of, and initiate these kind of projects of global development and humanitarian aid that become completely normalized and widely accepted, but really before then are not, that this doesn't become a significant part of politics until around this time. And it really is this development from, I mean, Samuel Moyn's book, The Last Utopia, right, where human rights advocacy kind of replaces or succeeds earlier kind of progressive left projects. So it's all part of this development. So anyway, it's intriguing to me that Foucault kind of occupies this role as a kind of nexus between these various political developments, this reconceptualization of the subject, but then this kind of turn towards this post-political humanitarian aid conception of politics, which is really explicitly pitted against the earlier projects of the sort of communist and Marxist left, when these things are being debated, like around the Vietnamese boat people, sort of refugee crisis of the late 70s. Foucault is very much on the side of the universal humanitarian imperative, without regard to the political context. So that's all, again, a bit of a tangent, but I'm just curious whether you agree that there might be some relevant threads there.
Yeah, it's really interesting because one of my favorite books on this, or like I suppose series of books or a book and some papers, is by David Chandler. Well, David Chandler and Julian Reed, on the neoliberal subject, and bunch of other stuff published around that same time, around 2015, 2016. And I just think they understood it completely. Like what I've been describing, about the subject is the end point. I mean, that's what David Chandler says, and what Chandler and Reed say, although they write different chapters within the book. That's why I keep jumping between their two names. But what's interesting about him is that he kind of did the same thing. Like I read that book as like this brilliant critique of this destruction of subjectivity, very similar to kind of James Heartfield's Death of the Subject, which I think on my bookshelf behind me. Death of the Subject Explained, which is very good. It's sort of an easier version of Zizek's Ticklish Subject. And so I read that as great, and then I go to interview him. And he's all talking about like decentralize this, that, blah, blah, blah. And he just kind of like gone all in on it. And I didn't realize that he was like promoting what I thought he had been critiquing. And it's very similar to Foucault in that kind of way, and this sort of like ambiguity. And I think I realized it's because he took the destruction of the subject as complete, as not something that is ideological, but that is just actually gone. That like working class subject of the 19th century revolutions is just dead and gone. And to a certain extent that is true, but to a certain extent it is not true. And that is why the subject is such a problem for policymakers. And I feel like I don't think I stress this enough, but how pervasive this hatred for men is, and tradition and the family is amongst policymakers, amongst like in the European Union. I use this example all the time, but I remember I was watching one of these debates in EU Parliament, and one of the speakers was like, "Oh, let me tell you, I cannot tell you enough about our wonderful rainbow families, our beautiful," and she's just a beautiful rainbow families, but she cannot bring herself to say the family. To like vomit in their mouth before they say the family or parents. They talk about informal caregivers instead of parents, right? But they will talk endlessly about rainbow families. Why? Because they think that these are going to be these ideal subjects that are going to be unmoored from tradition. Whereas the traditional family stands for tradition, right? And what is tradition? What is traditional masculinity that is so maligned? Well, traditional men remain stubbornly tied to the myth of rationality. They stubbornly believe in their own self-worth. You hear about this all the time. It came in like the debates around the gender pay gap. It wasn't like it wasn't always like women should be paid millions and millions of TV presenters. It was like men are being paid too much. Or when it came down to the workplace, it was like men are delusional about their worth. And so they negotiate more, right? So they're getting paid too much. No. We're all delusional about our worth. We're all worth more because we're the ones who run everything. That's the workers that run everything. At the end of the day, there's no business to run without the little mice on the little hamsters on the hamster wheels. But women are the ideal workers now. You want a woman to come in because she will pull an all-nighter to get it right. Man's not going to do that. You know how many times I've been like, "Oh man, I was up all night getting this report done," and my male colleagues are looking at me like, "Are you insane? I've literally never done that in my whole life." But the women will do that. We will work all night long to get it right, and we feel grateful. We're so grateful to be exploited, and this is all really bad. This is horrible. But to those in power, for the sort of like neoliberal governance or post-liberal governance, that's fantastic. You should be quite grateful for your exploitation. You should be, grateful that you're included in the order, that you work in your crappy service job because we need you in the crappy service jobs. But men, they are too stupid. They believe in their own self-worth and they won't do those crappy jobs that nobody else wants to do, but women will have to do because they are desperate. And this isn't necessarily anything new. Marx talks about this in Capital Volume 1, where he talks about factory owners talking about how much they loved hiring women, especially women with children, because they would work forever because they had mouths to feed. And he says, like Marx says, they used women's, I don't know, like softer nature against them, something like that. So this kind of like this feminine socialization, which women had fought against, that feminists had fought against, was sort of like was turned around and it was like, actually, men, You should be like that. That would be great. And so Enlightenment man is no longer the bearer of democracy as he had been. So we needed Enlightenment man. We needed this man to fell feudalism to the ground. We needed the reasonable and rational subject to bring capitalism into being. But almost immediately, that man was like, okay, if I am reasonable and I am rational, then I should be able to determine my existence. And they did. They created the Chartist movement. They demanded the vote. And they almost had revolutions. 1848, the year of revolution. And very, very quickly, the realization set in sort of newly christened capitalism that that subject needed to be destroyed, that subject was a liability. And we live in the aftermath. But I think people still believe in themselves, I think, and especially men. They still believe in themselves, and a lot of women do too, and that's why they are so maligned. Like the women who like speak up, and like the women won't weesh movement in Scotland, and the TERFs and so on. These women who spoke up, they were utterly vilified and thrown out of society. Why? Because they did not meet that ideal subjectivity, which was to be accommodating. And I say in the article, you don't have to transition to be this ideal subject. You just have to show a willingness to conform to its diktats. And this is what women are supposed to be. Women are the guardians of rules and the guardians of morality. And as morality becomes more and more displaced onto institutions and codified rules, here's how 10 steps to a better you, and or 10 ways to deal with your coworker and this sort of thing. So you are supposed to kind of women are supposed to be this kind of heteronymous individual that you're supposed to look for the frameworks, not to tradition. Tradition's not going to tell you how to deal with other people anymore. It's not going to tell you anything about politeness. No, I need to know. I can't look at somebody and trust my judgment that I even know this is a man or a woman. I have to look to a pin. I have to look to some authority. I have to look to the new pronouns, the new ways of speaking always. And I remember I was at a conference at Swansea a long time ago when all this stuff was kicking off. And I remember this young, poor student running around trying to like move everybody around to the different rooms. And she goes, she's got like a pronoun pin on. She goes, okay, guys, into the... I mean, everyone, folks, into this room. And she's just like desperately trying to, she is modeling this ideal subjectivity. Like, oh, I cannot rely on tradition, on the thing that we used to say. What's the thing I'm supposed to say now? And she was struggling to find it. That's the ideal subject. So the ideal subject is this kind of sort of feminized, loose, fluid kind of subjectivity. And it is the destruction, is aimed toward the destruction of that masculine subjectivity that believed in its own power and its own ability to self-govern, its own reason. And sort of I began this by sort of talking about Foucault and a parallel in David Chandler. And I think if you think that this has really happened, then you don't realize that there's a battle to be won here. You think, well, that's just over, it's dead and it's gone. But I don't think so. And if it was the case, then those in power would not be so desperate to implement programs to challenge gender norms in Chad or whatever, because they want to root it out before it even starts. Because they know that this way of thinking is still exists, and they want it gone.
So I find myself wanting to kind of dig back into Foucault's development here a little bit, because the way I would understand his, or at least a large part of his project, is he has a critique of the sort of classical liberal subject, which is that, it's this basic idea that the liberties are kind of subtended by the disciplines. In other words, that formal freedom, as it's achieved in the French Revolution and related developments and subsequent developments, is in a sense kind of always already undone by the sort of techniques of discipline that make modern subjects suitable for functioning in modern society. And so there's this kind of suspicion of the original modern project, right? That it already at its origin starts to kind of undo itself. And there are various ways you can take this. I've written about it in the context of public health, that public health, is particularly important to Foucault, and I wrote a lot about this around COVID, that because it's founded, in the same period when this kind of modern notion of society as sort of contractual and guaranteeing certain freedoms to all individuals is also being developed. And then public health provides this alibi by which that arrangement can always be kind of suspended, right? Because there's always a justification on public health grounds for a state of emergency, which then suspends all of the liberties that are ostensibly being accorded to all subjects of modern societies. And so, in other words, again, there's this suspicion that modern society was never as free as it seemed. And so this enables a kind of deconstruction of the sort of classical view of how modern society and the modern subject functioned, by showing this kind of deeper layer at which that was all some kind of facade or lie, which I don't think is not exactly what Foucault thought, but I think it's at least an implication that's often been drawn from his thinking. And so then the question becomes, and Saurabh Amari's piece about Foucault from a year ago talked about this. We did a couple episodes of this podcast kind of touching on some of these themes. But the point is that, paradoxically, this creates, or this critique becomes the basis, or in part, of this kind of new form of subjectivity, which is instead of being, the critique of the old form of subjectivity is that it's too naive about freedom or something like that. The new form of subjectivity is fundamentally suspicious, as I think you were just saying, that it's about, it's informed by this hermeneutic of suspicion where nothing is quite as it seems. And so, I think interestingly Foucault, and so the question I think Saurabh asked, and we talked about some, is like how it can be that this, sort of antinomian project, or however we want to think of it, this kind of fundamentally deconstructive project can become the basis of a new form of society, or at least can furnish a particular kind of positive way of conceiving a new form of society. And you can think about this in terms of madness and the question of like why it becomes so I wrote about anti-psychiatry last year, why it becomes so important to insist that people who are blatantly incapable of sort of functioning in a normal way in society must enjoy the same freedoms as everyone else, and that that those freedoms are in a sense like more fundamental to guaranteeing those freedoms is in a sense more fundamental than guaranteeing the freedom of the kind of normal subject, right, which is viewed with suspicion. So the paradox here again is kind of how this thing which is posited as critique of the norm then can become the basis of a new norm. And again, we've talked about, before you joined this podcast, even Ashley, we've talked about Foucault already a lot, which just makes me think he's kind of, in a sense, just ends up being like the linchpin for all of these discussions, and his great significance can't really be overestimated.
Yeah, I mean, the what you ended with there is exactly it, that this sort of I think what happens when you take these kinds of critiques out into the public sphere and they become sort of productive in the world is you can really see it reminds me a little bit of like very bad first year sociology essays on social construction, where students understand social construction to mean it isn't real. That's not what social construction means. It doesn't mean that it's not real. Like The Enlightenment subject is a social construction, okay? But it's a powerful one. It's a useful one. The human subject is incredibly open. It has a capacity to be both resilient and vulnerable, to be both reasonable and unreasonable, to be irrational and rational, and so on. But the rational Enlightenment subject is a social construction, a historical construction and historical achievement that came about at a particular time, as I mentioned, of necessity, and then needed to be destroyed of necessity. And that, but what when people started to deconstruct it and say, well, it's actually just like a white man, etc. And obviously, I'm massive sort of painting with broad brushes, because obviously the critique is much more complex than this. That there's like this straight line of between this Enlightenment subjectivity and like the Holocaust and all these sorts of things. But what happened in all this sort of questioning was this reification of its opposite. So by sort of questioning, we see this with gender. Be like, oh, like gender is socially constructed, and therefore there are 57 genders. There are, there really, really, really are, and or like it really is fluid. It really is, but it is all of these things in potential, in the sense that there is an enormous potential for human beings, but you can't sort of reify one thing by deconstructing something else. You have to say, this is a better way for us to live together. It would be better if we lived as many, 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 many different genders than the two that we have. And I think people didn't necessarily do that. They thought that they had done the work by destroying the traditional thing, and they thought that that was enough. No, you had to say this was the better way to live. And that's another argument that I took out of the article, was like this. The right often wanted to talk about the trans subject as like this transhuman, ultra liberal, Marxist kind of like anything goes subject of absolute freedom. But it was not that at all. It wasn't like, I don't want to live by masculine gender norms. I prefer to live by these ones, and I have made a conscious choice of my free will to construct myself in this way. It was, I was born this way. It is a real thing. The other thing is a social construct, i.e., it is not real. And I am truly a woman in a true metaphysical sense. That is, and that is not, that is ontological gerrymandering. That is sort of like bracketing this realness of like the thing that I want, instead of arguing for it, but instead naturalizing it and thinking you've done the work by saying gender is a historical construct and a social construct. Yes, it is. But is that a bad thing? Well, in many ways it could be. But is the answer then to wear different clothing? Is that sufficient to overcome that problem? No, it sidestepped all these sorts of things. And I think because we have this kind of, that we can see a potential for openness of the subject. We feel very fluid. Nothing seems to be pinned down. Nothing seems to be given necessarily in the way that it used to, in terms of like, what does it mean to be a man or a woman? But this is at a time where we are not, at least a lot of people, are not encouraged as a progressive person to make judgments and to rely on your reason to decide how you will live. We fall back on a kind of naturalized science. It's not a science of discovery. It's a science of, it's not a science of creation, like the mad scientist, the Frankenstein in his basement, even though it seems that way. It is a science of discovery. It's a natural science. It's discovering what is already there, like and conforming with nature. So, like, surgeons are not experimenting on people. They're not Dr. Frankenstein. They are conducting gender affirming care. They're affirming something that was always there. People are affirming their identity, something that was always there. They're not creating something new. So this is a kind of a kind of a neutered kind of science that comes about through this kind of reification of by sort of destroying the subject, destroying whatever, by calling it a social construction, but not really thinking about it deeply, at least in practice. We simply reified and acquiesced to things as they are and took human judgment out of the equation entirely. Sorry, that was a bit of a tangent. Apologize.
No, not at all. Yeah, I think this point that there's a. I suppose one way to put it would be that there's a fundamentally, and this is not an original point, right? There's a fundamentally and like obviously conservative project here, which involves, as you said, a kind of reification. In other words, in which this project of transformation, of kind of infinite malleability and so on, actually has to be represented ideologically as affirming a sort of stable set of metaphysical ontological coordinates or something like that, that it has to be construed ontologically, or it has to be construed ontologically. And I think that also says something about the need to provide an ideology that is that functions as an alibi for certain kind of institutional realities and relations of power. Is that right? That, in other words, we have this world that is governed according to all of these kind of decentralized institutional structures that are highly bureaucratic and so on, and they need to find some source of legitimacy through ideologies. And so in some sense what this does is provide one such source. Is that a correct way of characterizing
Yeah,
it?
I mean, you have I mean, sort of going back to this sort of ideal of the subject, you have um, a world that appears increasingly outside of human control. And so you need subjects that don't expect to be able to control things, that recognize their um, autonomy as a risk to themselves and others. That's and Chandler and Reed say they are enjoined to live dangerously but never act dangerously. So you live in a dangerous world, but you must never act in a dangerous way. And this is why these projects are necessarily inclusive. Everyone's always talking inclusivity. Why? Because nobody can fall outside of its purview. Absolutely everybody has to come in. Everybody has to come in. But there's already something happening that needs to be named, that needs to be justified. And that is this kind of deterioration, the loss of control, even by like those in power, their own loss of control that's being articulated, and that they are kind of asking the world to go with, which is really scary and crazy if you think about it. Like I think about this with the degrowth people, to the extent that they're still around. Now it's interesting because that's all seems to have been forgotten, but for a long time that was the thing. But they were asking people, they could see something happening in the economy, and they're like, oh, well, this is just a harmonious stationary state to which the world is naturally progressing, not realizing like the extraordinary destructiveness of what is it like, what is a stagnating economy? It's the Great Depression. That's what that is. It's horrendous. It leads to world wars, this sort of thing. But they're sort of asking us like, well, what if we just went with it? What if we just went with it? Like we've got no control. And the extent that we do have control,
Well,
we have control over subjects.
I mean, I'd add to that I think this also helps account for why actually there's been a lot. I've made a couple of jokes to this effect, but you actually hear that since the tariff war started, you actually hear the degrowth rhetoric from the right now, at least in the U.S. That you hear
Which is
Trump.
where it belongs.
I mean, you hear Trump saying the thing about the dolls and whatever, but you also see like MAGA influencers and so on being like, we need to just be content with what we have, and what is this whole dream of being able to consume anything from anywhere across the world, like that's not the real American ideal. The American ideal is sort of harmony with your community and stability and so on. So it's a kind of right-wing coded version of the same sort of degrowth rhetoric, which I think goes to your point, which is exactly the point I've made about degrowth for many years, which is just that what it does is look at the reality, right, which is one of secular stagnation or whatever, and then treat that as if it's a virtue or an ideal. And so the fact that the right can easily find its own way of framing this rhetoric to take up the same. I mean, I've been joking that the right's sudden kind of anti-consumerist turn in the post-tariff thing is like, you can almost imagine you'll own nothing and you'll be happy as a MAGA slogan now, right? This is, a few years ago, it's like vilified as the Klaus Schwab's evil communist plot to ruin the world. Now you can actually imagine that as a MAGA slogan. You'll own nothing and you'll be happy.
Well, yeah, because it was always a right-wing thing. Like it's just
right,
that's
exactly.
why it was disturbing to me. I was like, leftists, stop saying this stuff. It belongs on the right. Now the right is saying it because they're in power. They don't have anybody to oppose them.
So I wanted to bring in one other thread just to complicate things a little more, because it's often, one narrative, kind of blame narrative, is like, oh, it was the gender theorists who polluted the minds of the youth. I think, we've tried to complicate that in certain ways by instead showing how they supplied a model of the subject that happened to, that not by coincidence, sort of tracked and was able to kind of name things about the emergent new political subject and sort of social order that came about in the late 20th century, and so proved useful for all of these kinds of projects. And the second big narrative that you often hear about these things is about social media, right? And social media contagion and all these sorts of developments. And clearly there's some truth to that. Like, it's hard to deny. I wrote about asexuality a couple of years ago, and it was kind of partly about all of these strange, the endless proliferation of kind of taxonomies of identity, which I compared to, if you go back to the 19th century, the period that's of interest to Foucault is like, you have these doctors kind of developing these taxonomies and like needing to label people. If people read Kraft-Ebing's Psychopathia Sexualis, it's this kind of catalog of different, weird sexualities and so on. And so what's interesting is that with social media, people start spontaneously doing this for themselves. Like, they're not, it's not doctors who are imposing this on them. They're actually developing these terms and then demanding that institutions recognize them on some level, right? So they go from Tumblr to sort of LGBTQ resource centers. So anyway, I wrote this piece called The Asexual Revolution that's kind of about this. But so clearly these forums and social media platforms and so on play a big role in all of this. But, and this is maybe I'm making it way too complicated, but I'm struck by your point about, as you put it in the piece, world building no longer happens in bricks and steel, but inside people's heads. So the shift from this kind of, growth liberalism, as you called it, which is about kind of developing, I guess, the forces of production in the world, building in atoms rather than bits, to use the term that's sometimes used. And, so you have this shift, and then, you have a shift to the fourth industrial revolution, the information age, whatever you want to call it. And, then at certain points, this kind of is framed even by sort of people celebrating it and advocates as in exactly these terms, but there's a kind of a shift of the economy towards the sort of interiority of the subject. And one phrase that was much used a couple of decades ago that comes to mind here is this idea of cognitive surplus, which was from this journalist Clay Shirky, who was kind of, something of a kind of booster and promoter of social media as positive, like back when there were people who, got a lot of attention for doing that, like back in the utopian age of social media. And so the idea of cognitive surplus is just that, we have these subjective capacities that are not being tapped into or kind of utilized for productive ends. And so the way he frames it is more about, that these can be marshaled for like political activism and civic engagement and things like that. But you can also see how this, is conceived of by the creators of applications, right, as a means of generating profit, right? That in other words, this process of world building inside people's heads is in a way explicitly conceived of as a new form of, you might argue, and some, I don't know how well this idea holds up, but some people have talked about this as a kind of primitive accumulation, that the interiority of the subject becomes a new kind of resource to be mined for the purpose of ultimately, creating kind of profit generating enterprises. And this is how you should understand all of these kind of attention economy developments, right? The point of them is that there's some resource here that can be sort of strip mined and pillaged in order to, generate profit and growth. And of course, in some sense, this doesn't seem to really work. Like that none of these enterprises seem to have actually, solved the deeper sort of crisis of growth that, as you talked about, it took hold in an earlier era. And so instead, what you have are these periods where different models of this are just kind of floated by venture capital for as long as the bubble can be sustained, and then eventually it bursts. That sort of seems to be the pattern of the kind of pure information economy, where the goal is just to kind of capture some portion of human beings' attention and then use it as a means of, selling ads or gathering data that can then be sold, sort of bundled together and sold for various purposes. And I don't know. I mean, it strikes me that there's kind of there's like in a political economy beneath it. And so it's interesting to me that this project of sort of world building through gender, you could argue kind of occurs within this context of, an attempt to develop this new model of kind of informational capitalism or attention capitalism or something where, the human subjectivity or human, kind of interiority becomes a new resource that can be kind of exploited for profit in some sense. And I don't know. I mean, I don't know if this makes sense. It's just a kind of speculative jaunt, and so I'm sort of curious whether you think it makes sense as a way to think about this.
Oh yeah, I mean, others have made the point as well that like the brain has become this new terrain for exploitation, both in terms of like mental labor, but also for consumerism. So you have like all of these medications and so on. But again, it's never like, it wouldn't be so bad if it was like, I, as a consenting adult, am going to engage in some what are these people online that are really like crazy biohacking, like biohack, and they're just like, wow, you people are nuts. But you can take a ton of drugs and completely overhaul your personality and up your dose and down your dose, as long as you're like, I have this thing, it is me, it is who I am. And that's why I'm taking this. But yeah, that's absolutely, a huge part of this is this sort of opening up of new markets. And how we all become and I used to make a point about this a long time ago, and I've forgotten it. It's probably in one of my books. But there's this, well, I'll put it this way. I remember a long time ago when my sister first had her children, she was part of this moms group. And one of the moms, they reach term or whatever, and she just sort of disappears from the group. She doesn't bring her baby in, as everybody had been doing. And finally, she appears like 6 months later, and she's like traumatized from her birth. But what's funny is that in the lead up to the birth, she was like very, what we call crunchy. Do people still say that? She was like, oh, the rejecting the medicalization of childbirth, and she wanted to have like a home birth and a pool in her living room, and she's all about like the evil doctors that are medicalizing her and da da da. And she goes to have her baby, something goes horribly wrong, and she gets whisked off to hospital at the last minute. And luckily, her and her baby both survive. But she's like, this is a horrible experience for her. And she comes back, and she explains this whole story. And she says, "Yeah, I have birth trauma, which is a form of PTSD, which she had self-diagnosed with." And I find that to be such an interesting story because medicine actually saved her and her baby. The ability for her to be whisked off to the nearest hospital is why she was still alive. But she did not, she was like, rejected the authority of medicine but still medicalized herself. She was like, I will diagnose myself. Do you know what I mean? So she had rejected the medicalization of the body, which was actually demonstrably helpful, and and the authority of the doctors, and accepted the medicalization of the mind, which actually I think is really bad in a lot of ways, and also self-diagnosed so that she became her own oppressor. So it was like it's a basic kind of like the policeman is in your head kind of thing. But that's kind of what has happened, where all that we have done is move the locus for power, is very Foucauldian kind of point, into your own head. And so this sort of apparent questioning of power structures only led to an increased medicalization of the mind. And I find it just so interesting the way that increasingly the medicalization of the body has been questioned, where I think that is the most powerful area of science. And yet psychology and psychiatry somehow have in the American mind, they have so much authority in spite of horrible, horrible history and very limited evidence of success. Very limited. I'm sorry. I know people love, I don't know why, especially Americans. But and by the way, I sound very anti-American, but I always feel like I'm being self-deprecating because I'm from Canada and it's the same thing. So yeah, North Americans especially love their not pharmaceuticals, their side disciplines. But yeah, I don't have I think it is part of that broader story of the destruction of subjectivity, where like the authority of the doctor is that kind of like very human authority, whereas whereas that's been destroyed by the medicalization of the mind, and the vehicle that takes you around the world. Fix it when it breaks down. That's powerful. Instead, it's become this kind of like quasi-religious, taking care of the body so that it never does break down. And fixing it is like hubristic. And people are just expecting way too much. And, Susan Sontag talks about this like in the 1970s. She says like doctors were complaining that people have too high expectations, but you should have high expectations. Like that was like a core aspect of progressivism when it was like in the Enlightenment, was like, wow, we're going to have like these really long, healthy lives. That's great. It's just going to get longer and longer and healthier and healthier. And everyone's like, how dare you? You should preserve your body for as long as possible, but you can diagnose the hell out of your mind. But if you get sick, it's like, oh, what did you do? It's kind of your fault sort of thing. And that you're supposed to have this like healthy body for as long as possible. And it's a sign of your like, your moral goodness, but you can like diagnose yourself till the cows come home, and that doesn't reflect morally. It's not supposed to reflect poorly, as long as it's not a stigmatizing diagnosis. That's just fine. So anyways, I think it is part of this broader kind of destruction of that subjectivity, that all of that medicine and the doctors and the body and fixing it, that all represents a very passé kind of understanding of what science was for. And I think the rise of the side disciplines and the medicalization of the mind is very much about this sort of building in the brain, right? Building in the where development happens inside instead of out in the world.
And then, maybe the sort of final endpoint of this, well, I mean, a few things that occurred to me was, when I was kind of talking about, these various efforts to kind of strip mine human subjectivity for some kind of new profit generating project. Obviously AI is kind of the latest version of this. And it's interesting to note that one of the first sort of AI applications that was rolled out, 50 years ago or so, was actually as a shrink, right? That AI, Joseph Weizenbaum designs this program ELIZA, which is essentially a kind of psychotherapy program where you type in your problems and it responds in these very sort of limited ways, but it was sufficient to create this kind of illusion of care, right? That basically people, um, and then Weizenbaum sort of, wrote about his being kind of disturbed by this because he realized that people were projecting some kind of expectation onto the program he had designed, that it did, it did kind of constitute some kind of subjectivity that was actually sort of understanding and attempting to care for them. So anyway, it's interesting to me that that sort of belief in and dependence on the psi disciplines is sort of connected to the history of AI in a pretty deep way. And I think it's sort of interesting now that the sort of project of AI, I think in some sense is to kind of create some sort of new. I mean, there's sort of the economic, I mean, it's always very interesting, right? Because it's like posited as this, potential source of like infinite growth and abundance, but that's all kind of down the road. Somehow it'll reach this point where it can then do that. But in the meantime, the way people seem to be kind of experiencing it as like a new source of authority. And so that's kind of interesting to me here as well, which I think is why there are all these kind of culture war battles about like, is AI woke or is it anti-woke or whatever. Is like, when people interact with it, they somehow see it as possessing authority, as opposed to, these actual institutions which are sort of discredited and embattled in all kinds of ways. And so again, it seems to be like this bizarre project by which you kind of extract all of this value from human activity, turn it into this model, and then the model is kind of reified as this new kind of authoritative entity that can somehow tell us, and so people turn to it for like life advice and things like this. And this is a significant part of how it seems to be used today. And this again may be kind of a stretch, but I'm just very interested in how, this sort of basic situation of sort of dependence and of a kind of perpetuation of this situation of kind of dependence and reliance on external authority is then challenged by the fact that all of these institutions of authority are sort of challenged in all kinds of ways. And so we can get the path where somebody, as you said, kind of distrusts medicine, but then kind of medicalizes him or herself in order to kind of project this authoritative entity that will somehow provide this external guidance that is perceived to be needed. And then it sort of seems to me that AI is like the way it's pointing sort of politically and sociologically is like in that direction as well, that it ends up kind of being perceived as and functioning for people as this kind of new source of authority.
Yeah, I can definitely see that because I would see all the time in my research for my first books, there was always this critique of the self-help movement. And it wasn't like the kind of critique that I would put forward, just like it sounds empowering, but it's actually disempowering, da da da. No, they would critique it because they were like, well, these people are not experts and they're trying to help themselves. That's bad. That's risky. And so there's a kind of like a rational kernel within self-diagnosis, which is that you have faith in yourself to diagnose yourself, and your ability to kind of understand information and see what's wrong with you. But that has always had this really uneasy kind of that existence in the world, self-diagnosis. But so you have like on TikTok, like actually autistic, actually ADHD, actually blah, 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 because there were so many people who self-diagnosed that getting a diagnosis from a doctor was like an added sort of prestige, ironically. And that, but, we have this breaking down of faith in humanity. And so I write in the article, like, reason has to be removed from human beings as much as possible. It's put in like algorithms, it's put in, even like when people talk about expertise, they talk about expert consensus. So it's not like one singular person, it's like this blah Borg or something like that. And so they will like refer to these kinds of things that seem kind of dehumanized, and it's more authoritative the more removed it is from human fallibility. And you can see a lot of the faith put in AI is that it will overcome human fallibility, and that's the source of a lot of its authority, is that it's removed from humanity, or it appears to be removed from humanity, even though it is us, it's humanity talking back to ourselves, which is, I think, like the apex of alienation. But I think probably lying at the heart of some of this is a lot of the sort of misanthropology that drives this destruction of subjectivity, and underlies the um, hatred of humanity, is the fact that capitalists don't want they need people, they still need them. And that's annoying because they need to be fed and clothed and need to pay them to do that. And so that's the dance that we've been doing for, I don't know, 400 years or longer, depending on how you want to date these things. That that capitalists are trying to rid themselves of their reliance on workers, and workers are also trying to rid themselves of their uh, reliance on wages and this sort of thing, to move beyond it. And so underneath all of that is this disgust for humanity that I think always had this potential to permeate all the way up through the echelons of the system. But of course, the entire purpose, or the entire, there AI can't be a wellspring of abundance unless you define abundance as free time. But within capitalism, it can't be that. It can't be that. It's always going to be self-defeating. Because it can't produce any additional profit. Only human beings can do that. That's the sort of irony of it. So I don't know, just to sort of I suppose end on by introducing something totally new, which you should never do. I think I could say perhaps underlying, very, very deeply underlying all of this, is just that sort of basic political economy of a reliance on humanity that capitalists can't stand.
Yeah, just to add my own concluding point, I think that's in a way the best way to, even though it's kind of taken us away from the initial topic, it might be worth doing a whole episode on this, but on this sort of AI discourses, because I think it is deeply related for reasons that we've been discussing. It's all premised on this, as what you're calling misanthropology. It's different manifestations of it. And the thing that is so explicit, actually, if you read the AI boosters accounts, is, it's explicitly misanthropological, because it's, well, we could have all of these wonderful things in terms of a society of abundance and growth and so on, but the problem is that humans are too kind of hobbled by our cognitive biases and so on. And so we can't figure out how to cure cancer because we're too weak. And so what we have to do is create this kind of superhuman entity that will then fix all our problems for us, where we kind of take the flawed human nature out of the things we want out of the human being, and kind of just have those in their pure form, and that this will somehow bring about utopia. That's kind of explicitly the premise of a lot of the sort of AI, whether it's, various forms of accelerationism, but, essentially that's like the effective accelerationist discourse, right? It's kind of premised on this account of humans as deeply kind of flawed by this sort of rationalist anthropology of humans, as kind of deeply flawed by these cognitive biases that don't allow us to actually achieve the things that we might otherwise be able to achieve. And so what we have to do is kind of abstract the desirable human qualities from the human being, and let them just kind of operate on their own. I don't know. I mean, it really is as explicitly misanthropological as you could get, I would say.
And yet, ironically, it can produce something quite wonderful and reasonable, that through our reason, we would create something that takes the greatest stuff out of us and allows it to run. Well, it could be, I mean, not within capitalism, but, where it's part of the machines becoming our slaves, So the first time you have all societies, this is the argument, right, that everybody makes. Well, all societies are based on enslaving some group. It's that all freedoms are premised on the unfreedom of someone else. Well, all right, then let it be the machines.
Let it be the machines. Well, thanks so much. And we will return to related topics soon in the next installment. In the meantime, this has been installment 3 of The Crisis of Liberalism, an ongoing series from Blame Theory from Compact Magazine. So you can find this on the Compact Substack, and you can also find it on your preferred podcast channel. So please subscribe, rate, and review if you like what you're hearing. Thanks, Ashley.
Thank you.